Hi everyone, I'm Ariel Nye. I'm going to be talking about communication challenges in conservation surrounding chronic wasting disease in the Midwest. Some background on the communication problem. Conservation agents are doing research, but they're not communicating the results in a way that's usable for policymakers. Policymakers are unable to use the information that scientists are presenting because they don't understand what is being said or how it relates to what they're doing. And also another problem is that many scientists publish their papers in journals, but not with the policymakers. Scientists are focusing on sharing their results with other scientists, maybe bragging rights, maybe just better understanding for other scientists, but this doesn't help the policymakers because they're not getting that information. Some background on what I'm going to be focusing on with communication challenges is CWD, or chronic wasting disease. CWD is a prion disease that affects cervids like deer and elk and moose. It's highly infectious. It's able to spread very quickly by bodily fluids like saliva and is moving through the Midwest, both south and north, at an alarming rate. Up on the top picture, I have showing a healthy white-tailed deer. It's nice big fat deer, big antlers. On the bottom, I have a deer that has CWD. If you'll notice, you can see its bones. It's very gaunt looking. You can't really tell in the picture, but it does have a lot of drool coming out of its mouth. That's another side effect of CWD. They kind of walk around like they're drunk, which is why it's leaning on the building that it's shown on. They're very not healthy deer. So the communication problem is that there are gaps in communication. One of these gaps is called the knowing-doing gap. Policymakers know the information, but they don't use it to make relating policies. For CWD, there have been a few papers published that discuss the potential spread of the disease, but despite this, it's still spreading throughout the Midwest because policymakers aren't acknowledging the problem until they can see it, which at that time it's too late. I have showing in this picture from Cornell Wildlife Health Lab in 2000, there was only showing in a few states, and then 10 years later, it's showing in half the US. Still pretty mild, but there. And then as recent as 2 years ago in the US and the provinces of Canada, the cases are getting more extreme and they're spreading out even further. Another communication gap is called the thematic gap, where researchers are doing research on things that the policymakers don't need. For example, with CWD, they're researching the effects that this disease has on the animals, but they're not really focusing a whole lot on the spread. Policymakers need this information in order to limit the spread. And here pictured I have a moose that is affected, and again you can see the gaunt look on it. It's not a healthy looking moose. The third communication gap is called the disciplinary gap. This is where scientists' discipline and focus is different than that of the policymakers, and this results in unusable knowledge. For CWD, the researchers include suggested policy actions in a lot of their conservation science papers, but these suggested policy actions are very broad and they're not really usable because the scientists are more focused on their science discipline rather than the social science side, which is what policymakers have to deal with. Some solutions to this communication problem is to teach both graduate and undergraduate students how to properly communicate science with their target audience, which includes the general public. I remember in my undergrad, I had only maybe one time talked about how scientists are not communicating well. And it's been a constant theme in my graduate studies, and not every undergrad goes into graduate school. So I think it's really important to continue to teach graduates, but to breach that gap and talk to undergraduate students as well about how to communicate science properly. Another solution is to get research to understand policymaking practices better. This would include researchers being a part of the policymaking process, which I think is very important because that not only gets researchers to understand these social science aspects a little better, but it also puts the researcher there so they can help the policymakers to understand what they were trying to get across with their research. So I think this would lead to a better understanding from researchers and policymakers and get policies and regulations made at a better pace. My final solution is to get researchers to make their results easier for the general public to understand and connect to. And I think this is important on all aspects of researchers in science, not just conservation research. Being able to get results to the general public in a more understandable way leads to more trust in scientists, and it leads to the general public backing what scientists are saying. In the long run, this leads to less problems and less backlash in policies. Thank you for your time. Everyone have a great rest of the semester.